Let's bring in Mark Leibovich. He's a CBS News political contributor and chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. All right, Mark, so let's start with those early morning tweets from the president. Can we take that as a preview of the messaging that we're going to see coming from the White House after Sally Yates testifies?
It wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, I think it's consistent with past messaging and past comments they've made about Sally Yates. I mean, I think the question here, though, is the Senate going to be on board with this kind of messaging? I mean, this is a Senate panel. The Senate committee that is actually, that is going to be actually grilling her today has shown much more sort of, I would say, bipartisanship, but also a willingness to certainly look beyond the dismissive remarks from the White House. And I think you will have a very, very different kind of tenor from the questions, even from the Republicans on the committee, than you're having from the White House. I mean, I think the White House seems to be operating where if they feel they can appeal to the base, if they can sort of muddy the waters on Sally Yates, enough with people who are going to vote for Donald Trump, that's enough. It's very unclear, though, whether the Senate's going to go along with this.
Yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to sort of follow up on. What the White House said, well, the tweet that we got from President Trump is indicative of the kind of messaging that we've been hearing from Republicans in general. Republicans want to focus on the possibility of leaks, who's doing the leaking. The Democrats want to focus on whether or not there was collusion between the administration and and Russians, and that's basically the narrative that we've been seeing with both parties. Do we expect something different from the Senate? The hope is always that maybe the Senate will be the adults.
Well, I mean, I think part of what President Trump is trying to do with these tweets is trying to sort of queue up some questions, probably from Republicans on the committee, to try to sort of make the conversation today a little bit more about leaks, a little bit more about topics that the president and the White House want to talk about. I mean, I think what you do have to, at a certain point, you do have to step back and sort of take stock of the fact that this is actually an ongoing investigation. It's a very, pretty sensitive ongoing investigation. President Obama is effectively, he was Sally Yates' boss. He fired Sally Yates. He could fire Jim Comey tomorrow. This is all, I mean, traditionally, this is stuff that is not commented on at all from the White House. I mean, there's been a pretty, stern, church and state divide between these things, especially when the White House and the president himself, could be a topic of this investigation. So, I mean, the question is, at what point does this become not so much obstruction of justice, but really the active kind of live tweeting of a very sensitive legal proceeding that the Senate is now involved with? And at what point does someone, actually tell the White House that this is improper?
Right, and I think the question that a lot of people have right now, Mark, is how big of a cloud does this cast over the Trump administration's legislative agenda as it faces some major challenges on issues like health care, for example?
Well, what we've seen to this point is that whatever cloud the Russian investigation is, does seem to be operating on a separate track from whatever has happened legislatively, especially in this case around health care. I mean, health care is going to have, they had a victory in the House last week. There's no question about that. The question is, though, they're going to have their own challenges going forward to get that thing through the Senate, to get that thing reconciled with the House again. I mean, this is a long, long way from over. And I mean, there does seem to be a level of compartmentalization that's going on, both within the White House and even within Capitol Hill, to sort of let these two things operate separately. But clearly, I mean, the Russian investigation is an ongoing cloud. It's not going away, and today is going to be another chapter of that.
Speaking of the health care bill, we are already hearing from Republicans like Senator Susan Collins of Maine saying, look, the Senate is basically going to be starting from scratch with this health care legislation. Is that what we can expect, a brand new piece of legislation coming out of the Senate?
Well, it depends who you listen to. I mean, Susan Collins, very moderate, certainly, I mean, in so much as there are Senate moderates, she is absolutely kind of first among equals. So in a way, it's not a surprise to hear her talking like that. The question is that going to carry the day within the Republican caucus, and to what degree are they, willing to really tear up what they get from the House? I mean, some of the initial comments you had from the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate last week, were quite dismissive, not so much of the legislation, but, well, actually partly of the legislation, but also just of the institution of the House in general. I mean, there's a kind of big brother, little brother, or sibling kind of, dynamic between the two chambers to begin with. So I think some of that's playing out too. But I mean, I do think absolutely what we're going to see coming out of the Senate looks quite different from what we saw coming out of the House last week.
Mark, we also received word this morning that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be meeting with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in Washington on Wednesday to discuss issues like the Ukraine and the civil war in Syria. Can we take this as a good sign when it comes to the Russia-U.S. relationship?
I don't think it's good or bad. I mean, I think the question is, what will the message be? I mean, Secretary Tillerson has taken a pretty hard line on Russia since he started, despite his very, pretty well-documented dealings with Russia as head of Exxon. Look, there have been some mixed messages coming out of the White House. I mean, President Trump has sort of continuously he's taken a little harder line on Russia since, in the last few months or last few weeks, I would say, especially around Syria. But clearly, I mean, it's one of these fly-on-the-wall discussions, as we've seen over and over again, especially out of state. We don't generally get a terribly exhaustive readout of what these conversations look like. So I guess we'll just sort of see, and we'll try to figure out as much as we can, based on whatever information they release and whatever tea leaves we can figure out.
And Mark, quickly, staying on the topic of international developments, I want to ask you about the French election. With the election of Emmanuel Macron now in France, this is now the 6th straight European election, if you count both rounds in France, where the nationalist candidate underperformed the polls. So before this election in France, there were a lot of people saying in this country that the wave of populism that we'd seen with Brexit and with the election of President Trump was probably going to take root in sweep Europe as well. We're not really seeing that right now.
Yeah, I would maybe put the brakes a little bit on saying sort of cross-border, trend lines on this. I mean, I think what happened, 6 months ago, I guess today, in the United States was itself an earthquake that continues to just have incredible aftershocks, both to our own politics and to world politics. Now, there's certainly a narrative that the Trump effect at this point now, I mean, if there was a Brexit effect last year that predicted Trump, maybe the Trump effect now is signaling some kind of backlash in the other direction. I mean, I'm a little hesitant to the politics in every country are extremely unique. Yes, there's some overlap. Yes, you can look at global trends, but, France is not Britain. Britain is not the United States. I think there is a little bit of premature sort of looking for trend lines as far as where momentum is on these sort of large, complicated geopolitical dynamics. So, yeah, I mean, obviously it's a very, very good news, good news for the globalists, so to speak, in France. But, there are many shoes left to drop, both electorally and politically.
All right, Mark Leibovich, appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.